Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special FCC Zoom event called France Decides, and what the 2022 French election means for France, Europe, and the world. Before we get started, I just want to know that we'll be back in the same space again in the Zoom at the FCC tomorrow, same time, same space, because we have another election coming up. This seems to be election season around the world. The next election coming up is in the Philippines. And the next one's going to be tomorrow, Tuesday, April 26th, called The Election in the Philippines and the Race to Succeed Rodrigo Duterte. And we're going to be talking to our speaker, Richard Hedarian, who's going to be there. But what we're here for today is to discuss what happened in France on Sunday. And I've got two not only distinguished speakers, but old friends. I've got Dominique Moisi, who is a visiting research professor at King's College in London, a special advisor at the Institut Montaigne, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He is a founding member of the Institut Français de Relations Internationales, where he was a deputy director, and he's lectured at Sciences Po, Harvard, and various other places. He regularly contributes op-eds, including to the New York Times, and maybe you've read his most recent op-ed. And also we have another old friend of mine from my Paris days, François Heisbourg, senior advisor for Europe for the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, and also special advisor for the Paris-based Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique. And you chaired IISS from 2001 until 2018, and the Geneva Center for Security Policy from 1998 until 2018. And like Dominique, François' bio is way too long to read all the various positions and accolades and books. But I will just say thank you both for doing this, for coming and talking to foreign correspondents and associates and other interested parties here in Hong Kong. We really appreciate it. A lot of people here interested in what's going on in France. Dominique, let me start with you. Bienvenue. I haven't seen you in a long time. Good to see you, old friend. Are you relieved at the election result, and what do you make of it?
Well, I must say I'm deeply relieved. My wife was extremely nervous, and I was trying to reassure her, looking at the polls. But yes, there was a moment of great nervousness. Could the extreme right really come to power in France? And there was in the Anglo-Saxon press a kind of schadenfreude expression. We, the British, at Brexit, we, the Americans, at Trump, you, the French, by the end of the day, you will have Marine Le Pen too. It would be unfair otherwise. And now, here I am, and you've had Brexit, you've had Trump, and we have Macron succeeding himself for the second time with what I would say a very clear-cut victory. Now, I'm relieved, but I'm realistic. 60% of the French electorate have either.
I've lost the sound. I think we lost your sound. Can you hear us, Dominique?
Is in fact less than 40% if you look at the global, at the total electorate. And the good thing is that Macron is triumphant and isolated, but the opposition, united by its wish to destroy the system as it is deeply divided. And so, in a few words, and then I will let François give us his own reading of what happened, I would say I am relieved, but I'm not surprised, because my own interpretation of the situation was that in a post-traumatic situation, such as there was as the one lived by the French citizen because of COVID. Confronted with the return of war in Europe with Ukraine, I did not think the French were willing to add uncertainty to uncertainties. And from that standpoint, Marine Le Pen, though she softened greatly her stance, could not hide from the French public, at least majority of those who voted, two things. First, her incompetence. By the end of the day, we saw in the debate that she learned very little in the last 5 years. She was more smiling, she was more human, she played with her hands in a very elegant manner, but behind the smile, there was the reality of the extreme right. And in fact, two things in particular. The hijab, the veil, would be forbidden in all public spaces, which would make France quite unique in the world. And there was another point which attracted my attention and which will be more in tune with what François intends to tell us, which is he said very specifically, when I am president, there won't be the European flag behind me, just the French flag. And what we saw last night, the little ceremony accompanying the re-election of Macron was very significant. And there was an element of continuity and change. Continuity, there was the European anthem, the Ninth Symphony, but it was played very differently from 5 years ago. 5 years ago, in the Louvre, on the square of the Louvre, Macron came alone, and the interpretation of the Ninth Symphony was triumphant. The future is mine. Yesterday, he came surrounded by a group of young children, and the version of the Ninth Symphony was much slower. We are resilient. It's our collective task. So he wanted, through the sound and through the image, to try to give us a different image of what he was, what he had become after 5 years in power. He wouldn't be the same because the Ninth Symphony was different in its tune, and he wouldn't be the same because he was not alone, but he was surrounded by young children. Sorry, I was much too long, but I wanted to give you some kind of very subjective and objective interpretation.
Sure. And then before we get to François, Dominique, stay with me for a minute because I went back and I looked up a story I wrote for the Washington Post almost exactly 20 years ago. And Marine Le Pen's father had won the first round of the election and gone into the deuxième tour, the second round. And he ended up only getting about 18% of the vote then. And I quoted you in my story 20 years ago saying this was a political earthquake for France. And now Marine Le Pen, the daughter has come along and gotten almost 42% of the vote, 41.5, I think the number will come out to be in France. I mean, if that was a political earthquake, then what do you call this now? Are people now used to the far right or the what used to be called the Front National now being kind of a major player?
Yes, I think we've got used to it. Populism has been rising significantly, and not only in Europe, but in the Western and non-Western world. And so this is a phenomenon that is much less shocking. It should shock us that 42% nearly of French people would vote for the extreme right. It should shock us that the département d'outre-mer I mean, in Martinique, in Guadeloupe, you had nearly 60% of voters putting their ballot for a racist candidate. What has happened? So we'll have to ask ourselves these fundamental questions, but relief superseded the rest.
Yeah, thank you. And François, are you relieved? And you may recall, we also spoke 20 years ago in France. That was the election where Jacques Chirac, who was not widely loved, but ended up winning, something like 80% of the vote in the deuxième tour of the second round, because people just could not even stomach the thought of Jean-Marie Le Pen. This time, we have a centrist candidate in Macron. He managed 58.5%, which is, it's a landslide by US standards, but by French standards, when you're running against a far right candidate, are you relieved, or are you kind of thinking, wow, there's still something that we need to be worried about here?
Yeah, I'm obviously relieved, but like Dominique's wife, I was actually very worried. And yes, 2 weeks ago, I would not have been surprised if she had won. What we got yesterday was a divine surprise, a divine surprise, which the polls of the last 5-6 days had foretold. But that was not the trend over the last few months. And she came as close to power as was imaginable. And that explains the degree of my relief. And here I have to start off with a counterfactual. That is, what would a victory of Marine Le Pen have looked like? Well, in terms of competence, and of course, Dominique is right, she's incompetent, it would have been very Trumpian in many ways. I do remember that the Americans actually did bring Mr. Trump to power, which sort of relativizes the importance of competence as a yardstick for electability, as a proxy for electability. Competence is not a prerequisite, unfortunately. So it would have been incompetent, it would have been stumbling, it would have been vis-a-vis Europe like Brexit squared. What do I mean by that? Well, the UK had its opt-outs with the Union. It was on the periphery of the Union. The Union could survive and possibly thrive without the United Kingdom. The Union could not survive, let alone thrive, if France went to Frexit. And what she was advocating in her program and was in effect measures which would not have been conceivably implementable in the framework of the Union. And the only outcome would have been, at that stage, a Cameron-style referendum with or without the same outcome. And even if France had remained somehow in the Union, under those circumstances, it would have been a union vastly different from the one that exists today. And then, of course, we have the geopolitical consequences, with France essentially bereft of any alliance system. And in her program, and one never, one always forgets to read the programs of candidates, and that's a bad mistake. It's like people who didn't read Putin's articles on Ukraine over the last 2 years. She was essentially singling out 4 countries in Europe as being good partners for France. Hungary was one, Malta was another, Cyprus was a third, and somewhat bizarrely, Serbia, which is not a member of the Union, was the 4th. Now, you don't get very, all sorts of things can be said about some of these countries, but you can't really say that you can move stuff, get things done with those 4 after having chopped off their special relationship with Germany, after having made impossible the entente cordiale in the defense and strategic arena with Britain. We would have been all alone with Vladimir Putin. And I don't know what Vladimir Putin's contribution was to the outcome. Was it 3%, 4%, 5% in favor of Macron? Well, we will never know. But the fact is that many people were keenly and are keenly afraid of the consequences of the ongoing war in Ukraine, and they have tended to trust the captain who is at the helm. You don't change the captain in the middle of the storm. That certainly played in Macron's favor. So that is what we escaped. Has the extreme right wave peaked or not? That's the companion question. And well, actually, the best analysis on this is a sentence of all people, Mr. Zemmour, the ultra right guy, who tried to take Marine Le Pen's place at the head of the extreme right, who got 7% of the vote. And Zemmour said, well, this is the 8th time that a Le Pen has lost a presidential election in France. Her father and herself have managed to lose 8 times running. That's quite an impressive track record. It tends to indicate that anybody bearing the name of Le Pen is not going to make it. That's one piece of reassuring news. And another piece of news is that the character of the extreme right has moved to some extent from neo-fascism to hard left, if one uses the word national socialism in this context, she has become more socialistic. Why did 60% of the folks in Guadeloupe and Martinique vote for her? Well, it's not because they're racist, because most of the inhabitants happen to be Black.
Yeah.
They voted for her because she was perceived as being anti-vax, that Macron was seen as being pro-vax, that they essentially wanted to upset the whole system. They weren't being racist against themselves. That would take a bit of too much doing. So we're entering now, I think, into a new phase, and which will play out between, on the one hand, who will succeed Marine Le Pen at the head of the extreme right, and will Mélenchon, the extreme left, the hard left populist guy, manage to actually become the #1 leader of populism? He came very close. He came within, I think it's 400,000 votes from being the guy who was going to run against Macron. And this is what is going to play out to a large extent over the next 2 months, when we have our legislative elections, parliamentary elections, which Macron's people, I say people in the sense that we're talking about candidates here from parliament, will presumably win. But the question then is, what will the opposition look like, and who will run the opposition? So relief, some worry, but actually less worry than I would have had in previous circumstances. And there's also, and what Dominique said about the rally yesterday evening around Macron, everybody saw that it was a media crowd. There were about 5,000 people there. It was a small thing. It was stage managed. I vote for Macron. I worked on his team in the previous campaign. I mean, I'm one of his boosters. I want him to continue to succeed, but there was no enthusiasm. There was no grassroots endorsement of Macron's victory yesterday. I've been in post-election parties many times in France, and this is the first time in my recollection that the victory party ended at 10 p.m. That's not the French way, not usually. So my subjective version is that this was a rally which even Macron himself did not take at face value. He knows what he's up against, a deeply divided country. It's going to be very, very difficult to try to stitch it back together again. It's governability, which is going to be a big problem, rather than the near-term fear of having the extreme right come to power or the extreme left come to power. The issue is going to be governability. How will the country run, particularly if the legislative elections lead to an extremely fractured majority? The problem for Macron is not going to be to assemble a majority, but to have a stable and disciplined majority. And that's, we've already had shades of that in the last 5 years, but it's probably going to be worse.
So François, if everybody was not really excited about Macron's victory, or are you confident that he'll get the majority he needs, or at least a working majority in the elections in June for the parliament? I mean, how do you know that it's not going to be a right wing, left wing kind of?
Because of the way the electoral system operates, the Front National has very few locally elected people. The pool from which they can draw credible candidates at the parliament level is actually very narrow. The party machine of the Front National, the Rassemblement National, is actually not only broke because the Russian money has sort of run out, but it's also broken. It's a very weak machine, paradoxically. The one who may be able to build a machine is Mélenchon, but Mélenchon is his own worst enemy. I won't get into the minutiae, but I suspect that he will manage actually to build up some sort of credible opposition group, but it will be a minority. It will be a minority group, and by default, Macron will win, but he will win not because he has a party machine. He still doesn't have one. It's actually what machine he has is in worse shape than in 2017. But he will have a fractious one with the former Prime Minister Edouard Philippe having his ginger group, the Minister of the Environment having her ginger group, etc., etc. And each of these groups within the majority will make life miserable for the executive. So the president will be led to try to affirm his authority even more than before on the Élysée, on the palace itself. And that, of course, is part of the problem because he's not a good team worker. And he is an extraordinary leader, one of the best and the brightest, but he's not a team player. And old style politics where you have to cajole, in that sense, he's more like, he's sort of like Obama. He doesn't like to do the machine politics part of the job. He's not equipped to do it.
Dominique, do you agree? What would you say? Were people voting for Macron or were they voting against Le Pen? And what does that mean for these June parliamentary elections coming up?
Well, a significant segment of the people who in the second round voted for Macron clearly voted against Le Pen, and they said so. The clear-cut victory of Macron is due to the fact that more than 40% of the voters for Mélenchon had shifted to Macron. And so Mélenchon could say to Macron, I made you king. Now I will make sure that you are not going to be a working king. And this is very problematic. Mélenchon, in his speech last night, clearly said, all right, the third round starts now. And in the third round, we will redress the imbalances created by the first two. He turns towards the French who are unhappy and says to them, listen, I am the alternative. I know you have no enthusiasm for Macron, but don't despair. I'm coming. You can redress your vote of yesterday by your vote of June. And this is dangerous for the system. Now, if I wanted to pursue on the line taken by François, which I absolutely share, there's one word François has not used. And I'm not sure myself whether this word is not an important one now. In French politics, you have majority system of government, and ideally the president and the parliament are of the same majority. And then when it doesn't work, you have cohabitation government, which means the prime minister and the president are not of the same political color. But in Europe, there is a third system, which has worked greatly on the other side of the Rhine, and that is the coalition system. And are we up to, in fact, apply to ourselves a system that is so alien to our political culture, that we have denounced so fundamentally in the past, but that may be the only alternative left to us, i.e. the German model, i.e. Coalition could take place within the Macron forces, which will be quite, in fact, separate from each other, or open to, let's say, the Green will join in some elements of the left, whatever remains of that expression, some clearly elements of the right that will join Macron. So it will be a loose majority with many ideological and personal differences that would require what the French have so far failed to master, the art of compromise. Can you master the art of compromise? And here, again, I think François has touched the key issue. This is probably what is needed, but isn't there an absolute divorce between the personality of Macron and what the French political system would need at this particular juncture? And I think to go beyond that, and to, and will be my last comment on what François said, the Obamization of Macron has already taken place, which means the ability to deliver in speeches what you are unable to deliver in action. And if you are very severe, you could say that the presidency of Obama one day in the history book will be summarized in a series of speeches and essays. This is how great he was. For the rest, he didn't make it. And so if you add these characteristics of Macron-Obama, plus the need of the system, you can say to yourself, well, maybe the result of yesterday was a relief, but really nothing is solved. And maybe in 6 months' time, midterm elections will be bad for America, and America will be paralyzed again. But maybe you should not count on France to be the working, leading country of the West, because it may also run the risk of some kind of paralysis.
Dominique, stay there for 1 second. Let me ask you again, like I keep going back 20 years ago when we were talking in Paris and having lunch in Paris, we talked about whether it would be the Gaullist party, the RPR, that was us, Sarkozy running, or whether it would be the Socialist Party that are running of Lionel Jospin. what happened to the two main parties that dominated French politics for decades? Are they just gone? And why?
Yeah. Well, François is more competent than myself because he was a member of one of these two parties. I have been always an outsider looking at it on the other side of the mirror. But I think they both, in their respective manners, committed suicide. In the case of the right, Fillon did play a major role in the suicide of the Conservative Party. I remember what happened 5 years ago. I mean, history would have been completely different if Alain Juppé had been selected by the Conservative and not be rejected in favor of François Fillon, who then exploded a few weeks after. And in the case of the socialists, well, Hollande was a candidate by default. And Hollande was a candidate by default because of what happened in a New York hotel in a particular morning with Dominique Strauss-Kahn. So in a way, the taste of Strauss-Kahn for women and the taste of Fillon for suits have accelerated the explosion or implosion of these political forces. I'm saying it jokingly, but I think it's a serious matter and one that is problematic for the sake of the future of democracy in France. But you have someone who is an expert, who was at least an expert from inside, so he knows much better than myself.
François, you're on stage. You're the expert. So Dominique has said the two parties committed suicide. So can they resurrect themselves? Is this Easter?
Yeah, it's assisted suicide, to be entirely fair. In the case of the socialists who were blown up first, Macron was masterful at helping the Socialist Party disintegrate in 2016, 2017. It was quite extraordinary, and the destruction of the right. Of course, I agree with Dominique that the world could have been, in the case of France, could have been quite different had there been a different candidate on the right in 2017. We'll never know. It's a counterfactual, but I think it's highly likely. But it's what happened in the following 5 years, which led to the ongoing suicide of the mainstream right. But what is happening beneath the anecdotes, and anecdotes are not trivial. I mean, I agree with Dominique here that one has to pay attention to them because they reveal a deeper and underlying process. We, like the Americans, like the British, have been moving more and more towards something rather different from the traditional left-right paradigm at the social level. That is, those who want to soak the rich, to put it in caricature terms, and those who want to protect the rich. That's not entirely over, and that's what Mélenchon is certainly playing on. But the more meaningful paradigm now is the one between the nowhere people and the somewhere people. Those who identify with the problems that they encounter in their village because of the ravages of globalization. That's the gilets jaunes, to put it in its purest possible manifestation, and those who are intensely happy about being part of of liberal globalization. For that, you look at the Macron's votes in the New York metropolitan area yesterday. 80 to 90% in favor of Macron. And that divide is not going to go away. And indeed, that's what makes Mélenchon very worrying. I mean, he is not talking about competence. I'm not sure he has what one would call technical competence. There are plenty of things he pretends or doesn't actually understand, but he is politically one of the most clever people around, and certainly the very best speaker of them all. I mean, he really knows how to speak to folks. But Mélenchon is both the guy who continues to keep the social question alive, but he's also a somewhere person. He doesn't like Europe. He doesn't like alliances. He likes Russia. And indeed, he had to spend some time during the first round campaign distancing himself from Putin. He understood early enough that the war in Ukraine could be dangerously toxic for those who had taken his own line. And so he managed to distance himself with Zemmour and to a lesser extent Marine Le Pen taking most of the flack for that. Now, how will this France that we have both described, how will this affect the world, if I can put it that way? The world around us, meaning Europe, of course, that's the primary area of concern, but also the wider relationship at the global level, relationship in the Indo-Pacific, relationship in Africa, and so on. Well, the good news is that, and it's a little bit like the American good news, except it's better than in the States, and that is the president is in charge of defense, and de facto is in charge of foreign affairs. And what makes it better than the States is that you don't have a Senate to make your life miserable when you try to be the imperial president. And you also benefit from being generally trusted by the public. The French public, until proven otherwise, tends to trust the person who is in charge of diplomacy and defense. If there's a war out there which the French don't like, and I take the example of the war in Libya in 2011, 2/3 of the French were against military intervention. This was under Sarkozy. Except that once Sarkozy had decided that we had to intervene, and we effectively intervened, bombing Gaddafi and so on, the proportions turned the other way around. 2/3 of the French said, yeah, this is a great idea. This is the rallying around the flag, the rallying around the flag effect remains very, very strong, and this is an asset. This means in practice that if we try to do things in the European context, in the Atlantic context, in the Indo-Pacific context, the president is not going to be impaired in what he does. And I'll give you a practical example. The French have been very prudent in disclosing what they're doing in terms of providing arms to Ukraine. And we've been doing it for quite a number of years. And we keep quiet, because we want to keep lines of communication, or I put that in the past. We found it important to keep lines of communication open with the Russians, and also reasons of operational security. Then what does Macron do 3 days ago? 3 days ago, literally, he announces that we are going to ship to Ukraine, and maybe already have begun actually to do so, some of the world's very best long-range, high-precision artillery, so-called Caesar system. This is a very hot item. It has been used in war in the Middle East with very good effect, and it will certainly serve a very good purpose against the current Russian offensives in the Donbass. he went public, and he didn't, and nobody berated him for that. None of the candidates said, you shouldn't be doing this. This is an electoral ploy. You're doing this in order to provoke a patriotic reflex for illegitimate campaigning purposes. None whatsoever. It just went down like a treat. Not because everybody approves. I suspect that many people don't approve, actually. I do, but I'm sure many people don't want us to get too much involved in Ukraine. No, this is normal. This was a president. It's his prerogative, even 3 days before an election. This is reassuring for the world. So that's very much the good news. And good news is indeed that the French population, while it is extraordinarily unhappy with the Jupiterian manner of Macron, and the degree of disaffection and hatred which you find in a large part of the French population against Macron is very, very deep. It's comparable to the kinds of hatreds or disaffections that you have in the American context between Trump and Biden. You love them or you loathe them. And it's
why is so much hatred against Macron, though? He seems to have done a good job.
No, sure, no, and I'll say a word about that. He comes across as an arrogant, down-looking person, lecturing, hectoring, and it's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. And I mean, he understands this, and he's been like that since, I'm told, since he's been age 15. He's not going to, literally, and that's not going to change. People understand that this is part of the package, and it's also in a way part of the package which got him elected. What got him elected? This is interesting. COVID and Putin are a major part of the story. He, as a crisis managing president, he's done exceptionally well, and you can demonstrate that in political terms, in electoral terms. I haven't, not on Putin yet, I haven't seen granular analysis of how the Putin effect may have played on different parts of the electorate. But in the case of COVID, we do have retrospective analysis. And one of the things that he did during COVID, one of the smartest things he did, was to save the catering restaurant business in France, artisans, liberal professions. All of these got immediate, massive, and well implemented breaks in terms of debt relief, social security relief. All of this was done in very good time and very well, and you can see it in the electoral statistics. That is, the sector which I just mentioned is traditionally voting for either the extreme right or for the mainstream right. Hardly ever for the left. Well, they voted massively for him because they actually recognized that he saved their bacon, and in saving their bacon, he's also saved economically the country, because France is still a great place to be in and to go. Inflation rates are much lower than in the rest of Europe. This is interesting. The measures chosen were actually very competently selected, and the growth rate, the recovery from COVID remains one of the best in the world. I mean, in 2021, we had the same growth rate as China. This hasn't happened to us since 1970. Yes. So the French are torn between two things. One is this guy who saves our bacon, literally, and he can only do so if he acts like Jupiter launching his bolts on the one hand, and on the other hand, they don't feel represented by this arrogant pipsqueak, if I can use those words. And they would like to see a much more inclusive, much more consultative, less presidential system. And squaring these two, the German system, as Dominique put it, the best system today in terms of country management is arguably the German one. But it's completely alien indeed to our tradition. And on the other hand, the French expect everything to come from the state. Yeah. And the state means ultimately the president. So for the world, a ride with Macron is not going to be very different from the ride that we had during his first term. And I think that's basically good news.
Yeah. Dominique, let me ask you, you know America very well. You had a piece in the New York Times recently. You know America is divided between left and right, the Republicans, Democrats, and nobody's been able to break that two-party system. Do you think there's a possibility for a Macron-like figure to come along, as Macron did in France, and break that monopoly of the left and right? Are people yearning for that kind of centrist, I'm not really left, not really right, to come along and do something different, or is it just too different across the Atlantic?
In all honesty, it's a very difficult question. The polarization of French society runs very deep. You have the division between the have and the have not, the more educated, the less educated, the young and the old, and you could see that. So it's very deep divisions. But somewhere, I have the feeling that the polarization in American politics is even deeper, is on a different scale, on a different nature. At some point, I forgot who it was, but there was someone, in David Brooks or a bright columnist, who said that for the Republican, the Democratic Party was a bigger threat to America than Russia and China together. This, I don't think you could say in France at that level, because the wounds that exist in America are much older, much deeper. They transcend personalities, they transcend economic situation. We are in France at a particular juncture where there is a total divorce between the results of Macron, which are in Marxist terms, I would describe as globally positive. I mean, and I won't quote back the figures given by François, and the attitude towards him is the most hated president of the Fifth Republic. And because to a large extent is simply too much. Hollande was presenting himself as a normal man after Nicolas Sarkozy, but the French found that he was not only too normal, but too average, and that they didn't feel represented by him. In the case of Macron, it's just the opposite. You can't associate with him because he's too young, too bright, too handsome, too rich, too cultivated, too of everything, and still particular. So, I mean, not everybody marries a woman 25 years older than yourself. So they can't find a way to associate with him. He is simply, he seems to come from another planet and unite them. And so I think to answer your question, you have to integrate those two elements. The reaction to the personality of Macron, which is quite unique, and the nature of French polarization versus American polarization. And my intuition, but it's purely intuitive because you can't put it objectively, is that, I don't know whether François shares my vision or not, is that the polarization of French society is not as deep as the polarization of American society. But we may be at the beginning of a process. It's not a fixed situation. So it's a moving thing. Polarization is not an event. It's a process.
Yeah.
And it may move in one direction or the other.
But Dominique, you said, Macron is not relatable to people, but I noticed after Zelensky became very popular, suddenly Macron was wearing a hoodie and he didn't shave, and so maybe that was making it more.
It is a very interesting thing, this comparison with Zelensky, because by the end of the day, both presidents are actors. Zelensky is a professional actor. You have to see him servant of the state, his television series. And Macron is an actor and quite good at that. But Zelensky is an empathic actor. Macron is rather cold. I would say Macron is in the role of Laurence Oliver in Great Britain. I'm acting, but it's in a way, and I've known him for quite a long time, two political persons have struck me as incredibly charming in their body languages. One was Bill Clinton, and I'm small, very small. He would come to me, would put his hands on my shoulder. I would feel protected. And I would say the President of the United States, as he speaks to me, thinks I'm the most important person in the world. I feel exactly the same thing with Macron. We are more or less the same side, but he's a bit taller. But he has a way of looking at you in the eyes, of holding your hand for a very, very long time. And so he can seduce people individually, charm them, court them. But the moment he arrives in a bigger group, suddenly he loses that empathy to it. And it's a very mysterious thing. One-to-one, you can't resist him. Much bigger audience, you tend to resent him and reject him. And I don't know, it's there's no explanation for that. But this is something I felt, and I think looking at François, he feels exactly the same.
Yeah, is that true, François?
That is true. You got it exactly right. And what makes him so incredibly seducing, it's a process of seduction, is that it's genuine. When it happens, it's genuine. That is, he really is interested in knowing everything about you, and he charms you, and but it's not utilitarian. It's not simply utilitarian. Any good politician has to have some of that quality. But in his case, from what I hear, it really does go back to his teenage years. So it's something very deep, and because you feel that it's deep, it works even stronger. And he does this, I would add, with everybody. When he was doing his big debate with Marine Le Pen, in which he trounced her, towards the end of the debate, there was a very brief lull, and they exchange, for a few seconds, they exchange banter, and he touches her. He's very tactile, and that hasn't changed. Now, on the divisions of society, this is a very interesting question. If I were to make a comparison, I would make the comparison between the divisions of French society with those of British society, rather than those of American society.
American society, absolutely.
American society, it's all about, well, not only about, but it's largely about culture wars. And God knows if the culture wars in the States are terrible, the people hate each other's guts, and they have a very clear sense of where they stand. The culture wars from the States have been to some extent imported into France. We see attempts at installing cancel culture and wokeism in French universities and so on. There's a little bit of that, but the rejection is practically universal. This is, in a way, people on the left and on the right and at Macron and at Le Pen, they hate the New York Times just about as much across the board. The reporting on France provokes revulsion. And this is not simply about political preferences. Yesterday, a French observer was doing a summary of the articles on Marine Le Pen in the New York Times over the last 3 weeks. There were 5 or 6 of them. And they were all along the lines, oh, she's won anyway, whatever happens on the 24th of April.
She's won already.
She's won already.
I was shocked. I was so shocked by that.
She has, etc., etc.
I was so shocked.
Absolutely. And Macron for a long time actually refused to receive, to give appointments to the New York Times correspondents in France, because so culture wars, American style, simply not working. What are the divides? Well, it's very simple, and any Brit who analyzes British political polarization will recognize this. If you earn less than €1,500 a month, that's about 20% more than the minimum wage. If you haven't gone to college, and if you live in a municipality which has less than 5,000 inhabitants, chances are that you're going to vote for Le Pen. And if it's the other way around, and if you tick all 3 of those boxes, the correlation, must be at about a 0.8 or 0.9 level on a scale of 1. This is as stark as it can get, and the sophologists in France who work on these issues come up with these incredible maps. Some people say that geography is destiny or demography is destiny. Well, in this case, if you tick those 3 boxes, your destiny is sealed. You know for whom you vote. But it does have a different flavor than the American flavor. That I can confirm.
Thank you. And we're just about out of time, but one last question for both of you. Very quick question. We only got about a minute left because I promised you an hour, but I always like to ask all of our guests here at the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong, for our listeners and viewers and people who watch this, what are you reading these days? What do you recommend? Anything you're reading? Fiction, non-fiction, anything of interest? Well, François, you go first. What are you reading?
I'm reading Mary Serrate's book called Not an Inch, which is about the enlargement process of NATO, how it was handled by the Americans, the Germans, the Russians, and so on, from 1989 to nowadays, in order to understand what has happened between the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the first new European war, big war, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That is an indispensable book. She really has done a fantastic work in terms of interviewing people and going through the archives getting stuff declassified by FOIA and so on.
Mhm. Oh, interesting. Dominique, what are you reading these days?
Well, I barely dare to tell you. I'm rereading Marcel Proust, and I've been doing so since the beginning of the confinement. So I'm close to having read the entire research of Lost Time. And this is not losing time. It is one simply of the greatest writer of humanity, and the kind of perfect retreat or refuge between COVID and Ukraine.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, my next book is being sent to me by someone from the French consulate here. It's Joseph Cassel, Hong Kong and Macau, and I have to read it in French, they say, because there's no translation.
Formidable.
Looking
Thank
forward
you
to
very
that.
much.
Thank you, Dominique, Moisi, old friend, cher ami. Thank you so much for coming in. François, Heisbourg, I miss you in Paris. We'll have to get
I miss
together
you
sometime
too.
and have a drink. Thank you for joining the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong for this Zoom talk. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. This will be on our YouTube channel very soon. Again, congratulations, félicitations, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having invited us. Thank you.
All righty. Take care. Bye-bye.
Keep safe.
Bye. François,
À bientôt.
namaste.
Namaste.